So, usually when we look at a map of a modern nation state, there is this innate expectation of engineered precision.
Right, like it's all perfectly planned out.
Exactly. You look at an atlas, and it feels like examining an architectural blueprint. You see those clean borders drawn in solid black ink, the capital city marked with a decisive little star, the provinces neatly color-coded.
And it conveys this real sense of permanence.
Yeah, deliberate design.
Mhm.
You point to a shape on the page and confidently say, there it is, that is the country, and inside those lines is a unified people.
Well, the lines on a map offer a comforting illusion, of a binary world. The implication is that everything inside the boundary is cohesive and everything outside is foreign. But human geography, especially in regions with deep, turbulent histories, actively resists that kind of simplistic categorization.
It's just never that neat.
No, the reality on the ground is rarely dictated by neat lines. It is shaped by survival, topography, and, the slow accumulation of centuries of conflict.
Okay, let's unpack this. Step into the historical landscape of Iran. Specifically, that 500-year sweep that forged its modern identity, and that clean architectural blueprint completely disintegrates. We are faced with a geographical and cultural reality that is immensely complex. Today we are doing a deep dive into Abbas Amanat's monumental 1,000-page historical work, Iran, a modern history, alongside the insights of readers who have navigated this massive text.
Which is a serious undertaking.
Oh, absolutely. Reviewers frequently describe Amanat's work as a typhoon of information, a narrative that is both devastatingly tragic and incredibly beautiful. Our mission today is to sift through that typhoon for you. We're going to examine the evolution of Iran starting in the 16th century, exploring how a specific set of harsh geographical realities, ancient philosophies, and, well, radical religious shifts constructed the modern Iranian identity.
Right, because to comprehend the headlines coming out of Iran today, the intricate geopolitics, the domestic friction, the unique structure of its government, you can't simply look at the events of the 20th century.
You have to go way further back.
Exactly. The foundation of those headlines was laid half a millennium ago. To truly understand the modern state, we have to examine the rise of the Safavid Empire, decode the deeply ingrained cultural concept of the walled garden, and trace the origins of a very specific historical tension between religious authority and absolute state power.
So the most logical place to start building that understanding is at the literal physical foundation, the geography of the Iranian plateau. In this context, geography is entirely synonymous with destiny.
It dictates everything.
It really does. The plateau itself acts as a massive, natural, four-cornered fortress. To the west and south, you have the Zagros Mountains, which are this incredibly rugged, seemingly impenetrable range of jagged peaks.
Very difficult terrain to cross.
Yeah, and then to the north, the high-altitude Alborz Range functions as a towering wall separating the inland plateau from the moisture of the Caspian Sea. And locked inside this ring of mountains are just vast, unforgiving, hyper-arid deserts.
And, the severity of this environment dictated every single aspect of human settlement and societal organization. Iran sits within the global arid zone. So the limited moisture the region receives comes primarily in the form of heavy winter snowfalls trapped on those high mountain peaks.
Because down on the inland plains, rainfall is drastically insufficient to support standard agriculture.
Right. Because water is the absolute bottleneck for human survival here, the landscape forced the population to organize into a highly precarious ecological triad. Basically, 3 distinct, interdependent modes of living.
Let's break down that triad, starting with the urban centers. When we think of cities, we often imagine them spreading out naturally along wide, navigable rivers or coastlines, right?
Like London or New York.
Exactly. But in the Iranian plateau, cities were relatively sparse and deliberately positioned at the very edges of watered plains, right where the drainage from the mountain snowmelt could be captured before it evaporated into the desert.
They had to catch it at the exact right moment.
Yeah, so these were isolated hubs of commerce and administration. Then, radiating out from those cities, you had the second part of the triad, the vulnerable agrarian villages. These were small farming hamlets scattered across the landscape, existing only in specific pockets where the earth could somehow be coaxed into yielding water and crops.
And the third element of the triad is perhaps the most defining, honestly. The nomadic pastoralists. Because vast tracts of the Iranian plateau consist of rugged mountain terrain or dry, unforgiving steppe land, traditional settled farming was physically impossible in those areas.
You just couldn't grow anything.
Right. So the only way humans could utilize that territory was through high mobility. These communities survived by moving large herds of sheep and goats across vast distances, following the seasonal availability of grass.
Up into the mountains in the summer and down into the warmer plains in the winter.
Exactly.
And the sheer scale of this nomadic population is staggering. Up until the turn of the 20th century, nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes comprised roughly 40% of the total Iranian population.
Wow. Almost half.
Yeah. This wasn't a fringe element of society. And they were heavily armed, organized strictly by kinship and tribal loyalty, and remarkably diverse, comprising Turkmen, Kurdish, Arab, Baluch, Qashqai, and Bakhtiari groups.
They controlled territories so vast and rugged that the central city governments could barely project influence into them, let alone effectively rule them.
So the tension between the settled populations and the mobile tribes was a constant driver of history. But the settled populations had their own profound existential challenges, entirely centered around water extraction. To sustain those isolated cities and agrarian villages, the ancient inhabitants of the plateau engineered a breathtakingly ambitious technological solution, which is the qanat.
The Qanat system is just a marvel of ancient engineering.
It really is. A qanat is a subterranean canal designed to bring water from an underground aquifer high up on a mountain slope down to the arid plains. Workers would hand-dig a gently sloping tunnel beneath the earth, sometimes stretching for up to 30 miles.
30 miles, dug by hand.
By hand. And they had to calculate the slope with absolute precision. If it was too steep, the rushing water would erode and collapse the tunnel. If it was too flat, the water would pool and stagnate.
Plus, maintenance shafts had to be dug vertically every few dozen yards.
Right, to provide air to the diggers and a way to haul out the excavated earth.
And the creation and maintenance of a single qanat required an extraordinary level of communal labor, specialized skill, and relentless upkeep. It was not something an individual or a small, fractured group could manage.
It demanded absolute social cohesion.
Exactly. The qanat dictated human geography. A village could only exist where the water finally emerged from the tunnel.
Reading about this system, it feels akin to an ancient, localized life support system. Like, in a modern city, if the power grid fails, it's a massive crisis, sure, but the physical buildings remain.
Right.
In the arid reality of the Iranian plateau, if a qanat collapses due to an earthquake, or if the community fractures and fails to dredge the silt from the tunnel, the water stops. And when water stops, the crops fail immediately, the livestock die, and the village literally turns to dust and blows away.
The margin for error is absolute zero.
Zero. But here's where I want to push back a little. When you consider the precariousness of the qanat-dependent villages, alongside the constant presence of heavily armed, highly mobile tribal confederations roaming the periphery, a fundamental political question emerges. Doesn't this extreme isolation and vulnerability make a unified nation impossible? The landscape is a fortress shattered into 1,000 disconnected oasis towns and nomadic ranges.
It seems like it would, right? But what's fascinating here is that this extreme fragmentation is the precise mechanism that necessitated the creation of a massive, overarching central authority.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the harshness of the land demanded an iron fist to ensure survival. To mediate disputes over water rights, to organize the immense capital required to maintain regional infrastructure, and to protect the vulnerable, stationary agrarian villages from being completely overrun by mobile nomadic forces, a powerful counterforce was absolutely required.
Which brings us to the historical concept of the Mamleke Marusa, which translates to the guarded domains.
Yes, exactly.
So the State, in this context, was not just a bureaucratic entity. It was a necessary protective umbrella. The central authority sitting in the capital had to constantly negotiate with, strategically bribe or brutally suppress the peripheral tribal warlords just to keep the vital trade routes open and the agrarian base functioning.
Right, the geography effectively mandated a strong, heavily centralized power structure.
Okay, so if geography forced the creation of a strong center, we need to look at how that central power was actually wielded. If the fortress requires a central commander to hold the fragmented pieces together, the nature of that command becomes the defining feature of the culture.
Which brings us to the Persian philosophy of kingship, embodied in the concept of the Shah.
Right, and the historical sources draw a very sharp, deliberate contrast between the Persian concept of a Shah and the traditional Western European concept of a king. In medieval Europe, the monarch, the rex, often functioned somewhat like a priest-king, divinely appointed to lead their people on the righteous path, deeply entwined with the church.
But the Persian Shah operates on a completely different philosophical framework. The title itself derives from an old Persian term meaning the one who deserves to rule on his own merit.
So it's less about moral priesthood and entirely about possessing a specific, tangible aura of power called far.
Exactly. Far translates roughly to divine royal charisma. It's frequently depicted in ancient iconography as a literal ray of sunlight radiating from the ruler.
Like a halo of power.
Kind of, yeah. But while this charisma is considered divinely bestowed, it is not an unconditional, lifelong mandate. Far is entirely conditional upon the ruler's innate merit, their capability, and specifically their adherence to justice and the art of governing.
So there is a built-in cultural warning label attached to Persian despotism.
Very much so.
Like in the Shahnameh, the grand national epic of Persian literature, there's the foundational myth of King Jamshid. Jamshid begins his reign as the ultimate idealized sovereign. He builds magnificent cities, teaches humanity the crafts of civilization, and institutes Nowruz, the Persian New Year festival that celebrates the arrival of spring.
He represents the absolute pinnacle of empire building.
But as his power grows, he becomes intoxicated by it. He grows arrogant, demands to be worshipped as a god, and begins tyrannizing his subjects. And the moment he abandons justice, the divine far physically departs from him, flying away in the form of a bird.
Instantly, his power crumbles, his empire falls into chaos, and he is overthrown and killed by an invader. The myth establishes a core political theory. A ruler has absolute power, but the divine right to wield it instantly expires the moment they act like an unjust monster.
It's a fascinating check on tyranny.
And that myth underscores a deeply practical political model known as the circle of equity. Persian political manuals, written by viziers and scholars to advise rulers, constantly hammered home the necessity of a delicate, perpetual balance.
Right.
The theory dictates that the Shah requires a strong army to maintain order and protect the realm. To pay that army, the Shah requires a robust state treasury. To fill the treasury, the state relies on the taxes generated by a prosperous, productive peasantry.
So it's all connected.
Exactly. Therefore, if the Shah allows the army or the tax collectors to oppress and plunder the peasants will abandon their fields. Without agriculture, the treasury empties. Without a treasury, the army dissolves or mutinies, and the Shah loses his throne.
It is a closed-loop system of survival. But visualizing how this government actually operated day to day, a different analogy emerges from the sources. It resembles a massive, lethal game of chess.
Which is very fitting.
It is. It is no coincidence that chess, originally shatranj, evolved into its recognizable form within this exact Persian cultural environment. Even the term checkmate is a corruption of the Persian phrase shamat, which simply means the Shah is helpless or the Shah is ambushed. The dynamics of the Persian state mirror the pieces on the board flawlessly.
Oh, let's break that down.
Yeah, consider the Shah piece in a game of chess. Philosophically, it is the center of the universe, the most vital piece on the board. But practically, mechanically, the Shah is incredibly weak. He can only move one square at a time. He is isolated, vulnerable, paranoid, and relies entirely on a wall of pawns and powerful supporting pieces to survive.
That is the historical reality of the Persian monarch sequestered in the capital, terrified of assassination, trying to hold a fragmented empire together.
Exactly. Then look at the most powerful piece on the board, the piece Westerners call the queen. In the original Persian game, that piece is the vizier, the chief minister.
Well, the vizier has immense mobility.
Right, they can move across the entire board, executing complex strategies. Historically, the vizier was the brilliant, highly educated bureaucrat who actually ran the divan, the vast state administration, managing the taxes, the logistics, and the day-to-day survival of the guarded domains.
And finally, stationed on the far edges of the board, you have the rooks. These represent those heavily armed, peripheral tribal khans we discussed earlier. The game of statecraft was a relentless, brutal negotiation between the isolated Shah, the hyper-competent vizier, and the threatening rooks looming on the frontiers.
And the historical record bears out the fatal nature of that exact dynamic, particularly the relationship between the Shah and the vizier.
Bro, absolutely. Because the Shah was inherently vulnerable, heavily reliant on the vizier to manage the immense complexities of the state, a profound psychological paranoia developed. The Shah needed the vizier's brilliance, but was simultaneously terrified that the vizier was accumulating too much wealth, influence, and loyalty from the military.
It's a deadly catch-22.
Consequently, the history of the Iranian plateau is littered with the bodies of highly capable chief ministers who were abruptly executed, blinded, or exiled by the very shahs they faithfully served. The state bureaucracy, the Divan, never managed to establish an institutional independence free from the erratic, often lethal whims of the monarch.
Which guaranteed that the political center, despite its projection of absolute authority, remained incredibly brittle. But while the shahs and their viziers were locked in this lethal game of chess within the high walls of the palaces, real life, the actual fabric of Iranian society, was weaving itself together down below in the cities.
Right, the urban centers.
Yeah. To understand the population, we have to map out the physical layout of a typical Iranian urban center. These cities were essentially enclosed oases, heavily fortified with thick, towering mud brick walls and deep moats, designed explicitly to repel bandits and the seasonal raids of the nomadic tribes.
They were built for defense.
Completely. Inside those walls, the city was defined by a profound architectural and political polarity. On one side of the city stood the citadel, the Arg. This was the physical manifestation of state and military dominance. It housed the governor's palace, the military barracks, the armories, and the tax collection offices. It was the iron fist, looming over the population.
And on the other side,
stretching across the rest of the city, was the opposing pole of power, the bazaar. The bazaar was far more than a marketplace. It was a sprawling, dimly lit, roofed labyrinth of vaulted brick alleys. It was the industrial heart, the financial center, and the manufacturing hub of the city. If the citadel represented a military force, the bazaar represented immense economic leverage.
and physically separating but also conceptually linking these two opposing forces was the Maidan, the grand public square. The Maidan functioned as the central theater of urban life, somewhat akin to the Roman circus, but far more deeply integrated into daily commerce and politics.
So how did the citadel use it versus how the public used it?
Well, the citadel utilized the square to project terror and authority, staging massive military parades, executing dissidents and criminals in public view, and hosting elaborate polo matches to demonstrate the martial prowess of the elite cavalry.
Right.
Conversely, the public utilized the Maidan for open-air markets, for pitching tents during religious festivals, for mass public mourning ceremonies, and critically, for staging massive organized protests. It was the physical buffer zone where the demands of the state collided with the reality of the people.
And the bazaar was a formidable political counterweight because of how highly organized it was. The large-scale merchants, known as the Tujjar, wielded extraordinary wealth, financing a long-distance caravan trade that stretched across continents.
They had serious leverage.
Serious leverage. Beneath them, the artisans and shopkeepers were strictly organized into professional guilds. When the governors in the citadel pushed the population too far, perhaps by levying ruinous arbitrary taxes to fund a distant war or failing to protect the trade routes from bandits, the bazaar had a devastating defensive maneuver. Yes, the guild leaders and the Tujjar would coordinate a total shutdown. They would lock the heavy wooden doors of their shops, pull their goods from the stalls, and plunge the vast vaulted alleys into darkness and silence. This effectively paralyzed the city's entire economy, cutting off the state's revenue stream instantly, forcing the citadel into a panicked negotiation.
The dynamic between the citadel and the bazaar dominated the public political sphere, which was an arena exclusively controlled by elite men. However, one of the most vital contributions of Amanat's history is his illumination of the populations that the state actively attempted to keep unseen.
A hidden city.
Yes. The true complexity of the city reveals itself when we look beyond the public posturing of the Maidan and examine the silenced fabric of society operating in the shadows.
And that hidden city was vast. Consider the role of women in this deeply patriarchal structure. Among the elite, women were physically sequestered within the Andaran, the walled inner quarters of a household. Publicly, they were invisible.
But privately, they wielded significant power.
Exactly. The sources describe a potent hidden matriarchy. From within the Andaran, mothers, wives, and sisters managed massive household economies, orchestrated complex marriage alliances that dictated political power, and, in the royal courts, engaged in vicious, high-stakes intrigues to ensure their favored sons secured the throne.
There was also the uniquely Shi'in legal mechanism of Sika, or temporary marriage, which is a fascinating social dynamic.
Wait, so it's a marriage with an expiration date?
Essentially, yes.
Right.
It was a legally binding contract of cohabitation drawn up for a strictly fixed duration ranging from a few hours to 99 years.
Wow.
And the reality of Sika is intensely complex. On one hand, it was heavily exploited by wealthy men, often functioning as a religiously sanctioned cloak for exploitation or essentially legalized prostitution.
Right, I can see how that would happen.
But simultaneously, it provided a rare, pragmatic avenue of agency for vulnerable women. For a widow, or a woman from a destitute family, entering a temporary marriage with a merchant or a cleric offered immediate financial provision. Crucially, it ensured that any children born of the union were legally recognized and entitled to inheritance, providing a sliver of social mobility that the rigid class structures otherwise denied.
The domestic spaces of the elite also contained heavily assimilated enslaved populations, though the sources point out the nature of this institution differed fundamentally from the brutal plantation-style chattel slavery of the Americas.
Right, it was structured differently.
The Iranian state imported African slaves via maritime routes through the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, and Caucasian slaves, Georgians, Circassians captured during military campaigns in the north. These individuals were primarily integrated into urban households as domestic attendants, specialized artisans, armed guards, or trusted administrative eunuchs within the royal courts.
And their presence left indelible marks on the culture. We see this vividly in Siabazi, a traditional form of improvisational comedic street theater.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the central character is often a shrewd, quick-witted black servant who utilizes sharp satire and wordplay to outsmart, mock, and expose the hypocrisy of his wealthy, powerful master. It provided a sanctioned space for social critique and a fascinating inversion of power dynamics on the public stage.
Then we have the religious minorities, the Armenians, the Jews, the Zoroastrians, and later the Baha'is. Their position in society was a masterclass in contradiction. Economically, they were absolutely vital to the survival of the state.
Essential.
The Armenian community, for example, dominated the highly lucrative silk trade. They possessed a sprawling, sophisticated commercial network that stretched from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the Indian subcontinent, bringing immense silver wealth into the Iranian economy.
Yet, socially and politically, these groups were rigidly marginalized. The majority Shi'i population viewed themselves as the exclusively guided sect. Minorities were branded as the other, often subjected to discriminatory dress codes, heavy taxation, and occasional waves of persecution driven by zealous clerics.
So they lived in specific, designated quarters of the city, maintaining the economic lifeblood of the empire while being systematically excluded from its social core.
Exactly.
Taking a step back, the fragility of this entire structure is overwhelming. You have a paranoid, isolated Shah-hoarding power. You have fiercely independent merchants capable of freezing the economy. You have heavily armed nomadic tribes roaming the mountains, waiting for the center to show weakness. You have a society deeply stratified by extreme wealth inequality, rigidly divided by gender, and fractured along racial and religious lines. The entire geographical and social fortress seems primed to tear itself apart at any moment.
It really does.
So my question is, how does such a fragmented society not just shatter into a million pieces? What is the gravity keeping this disparate, highly volatile society from exploding?
The answer is profound, and it requires looking past the political and military structures, which were indeed a chaotic mess.
Yep.
The true cohesive gravity of Iran was inherently cultural and deeply psychological. The unifier was the Persian language itself, and its ultimate expression. Poetry. The resilience of the Persian language is a historical anomaly. Over millennia, the Iranian plateau was subjected to massive cataclysmic invasions. The Arab Islamic conquest brought an immense influx of Arabic vocabulary, fundamentally altering the script and the legal terminology. Later, centuries of domination by Turkic and Mongolian nomadic empires introduced vast amounts of administrative and military terminology. Yet, unlike many languages that were entirely consumed or replaced by conquerors, Persian simply absorbed these influences, expanding its vocabulary while fiercely maintaining its core grammatical identity and historical memory. It became the prestigious lingua franca for a massive stretch of the globe, used in courts from the Ottoman Empire in the West to the Mughal Empire in India.
But within Iran itself, the language served a much more intimate survivalist function. It was the vessel for poetry. When we talk about Persian poetry, we aren't just talking about academic literature read quietly in a study. We are talking about the verses of titans like Hafez, Saadi, and Rumi.
Yes.
This poetry permeated every single layer of society. It was recited by kings in the grand courts, by clerics analyzing texts in the mosques, by merchants drinking tea in the bazaar, and by illiterate caravanners crossing the desert.
And the sources reveal that in a society rigidly controlled by strict religious laws and autocratic political terror, poetry functioned as a sanctioned loophole. It was the one liberating space where profound subversion, deep skepticism, philosophical doubt, and even outright heresy were tolerated.
Like a safety valve.
Exactly. A poet could compose verses extolling the ecstasy of getting drunk on wine in a tavern, fiercely mocking the hypocrisy of the strict moralizing clerics, and celebrating forbidden romantic entanglements.
Well, wait, how do they not get executed for that?
Well, if a religious authority challenged the poet, accusing them of violating Islamic law, the poet could effortlessly deflect by claiming, "You misunderstand. The wine is merely a mystical metaphor for divine love. The tavern is the soul's yearning for God." Right. This deliberate ambiguity allowed a vibrant, subversive counterculture to thrive in plain sight.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because
Wow.
that ambiguity is the manifestation of a foundational psychological concept in Iranian culture, the profound duality between Zahir and Batin. Let's explore that duality, because it is the key to understanding the Iranian mindset.
Let's do it.
Zahir translates to the outward public appearance. It is the realm of strict adherence to the law, social conformity, and polite formal behavior. Batin is the inward, hidden, private reality. It is the realm of true feelings, intimate beliefs, and unrestricted freedom. To bridge this to a modern context, consider how we curate our own lives today.
Okay.
Zahir is your highly polished LinkedIn profile. On LinkedIn, you are flawless, you wear the professional attire, you deploy the correct corporate buzzwords, you eagerly agree with the prevailing industry doctrines, and you present an image of absolute conformity to the rules of the professional world. That is your public survivalist face.
Spot on.
Batin, on the other hand, is the raucous, unrecorded underground house party you host for your most trusted friends on Saturday night. Behind closed doors, the professional mask drops. The music is loud, the opinions are unfiltered, you mercilessly mock the absurdities of your boss, and you express your most authentic, perhaps controversial self.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. For centuries, Iranians refined the psychological art of maintaining a flawless Zahir, outwardly bowing to the authoritarian shahs and meticulously observing the rigid codes of the Islamic jurists, while fiercely protecting and nurturing their batin.
Right.
Behind the high mud brick walls of their inner courtyards and their private gatherings, they preserved an entire hidden universe. They discreetly celebrated ancient pre-Islamic festivals like Nowruz. They practiced complex systems of Persian classical music, an art form that survived despite persistent disapproval from Orthodox clerics. They maintained their true ancient identity in the shadows.
And a massive pillar of that internal hidden universe was the lingering legacy of Zoroastrianism, the ancient pre-Islamic religion of the Iranian plateau. Though the empire had converted to Islam, deep Zoroastrian concepts continued to pulse beneath the surface concepts that had actually profoundly influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam centuries prior.
The most prominent of these surviving ideas was the vision of an epic, cosmic struggle between the forces of absolute good and absolute evil. There was the concept of Pardi, literally meaning a walled garden, which represented an earthly sanctuary of order amidst the chaotic desert, and is the direct etymological origin of the English word paradise.
Oh yeah, paradise.
Yeah, but the most potent, explosive concept preserved within the batin of the culture was a deeply rooted messianism. In times of extreme hardship, the population harbored a fierce, hidden belief that eventually a charismatic divine savior would manifest. This savior would shatter the corrupt order, avenge the oppressed, and forcibly restore justice and balance to a broken world.
So when we assemble all these elements, we are looking at a terrifying historical powder keg. You have an inherently fractured, unequal society. You have roaming, heavily armed nomadic tribes eager for conquest. You have a vast, settled population nursing a deeply subversive, hidden internal culture, silently yearning for a messianic savior to deliver them from chaos.
It's a recipe for upheaval.
By the late 15th century, the geopolitical reality of the Iranian plateau was one of massive vacuum. The great empires of the past had crumbled into competing, warring factions. The cities were exhausted. The trade routes were highly dangerous. The powder keg is packed incredibly tight, just waiting for a spark. And in the year 1501, a 15-year-old boy steps out of hiding and drops a match into it.
This event is the Safavid shockwave. It is the exact moment when the geographical borders and the complex dualistic identity we've been discussing are violently fused together to forge the modern political framework of Iran.
To understand the sheer magnitude of this shockwave, we have to trace the roots of this 15-year-old boy whose name is Ismail. He's the heir to the Safavi family. The fascinating thing is that if you go back several centuries, the Safavi family were not warlords. They were a peaceful, deeply respected Sunni Sufi order centered in the northwestern town of Ardabil.
Right, they were mystics.
Yeah, they wrote poetry, guided disciples in meditation, and gathered a large, peaceful following. But as the centuries passed and political chaos, plague, and war swallowed the region, the nature of the Safavi order mutated. They transformed from peaceful, ascetic Sunni mystics into a fiercely militant, crusading, radical Shia fighting force.
And the muscle behind this transformation was provided by the Turkmen nomadic tribes we discussed earlier. These specific tribes, seeking refuge from the aggressive expansion of the Ottoman Empire to the west, gravitated toward the spiritual authority of the Safavi family. They formed a military brotherhood known as the Qizilbash, which translates to the Redheads.
Because of their hats.
Exactly, named for the distinctive crimson caps they wore, which featured 12 folds representing the 12 Shia imams.
And the theology of the Qizilbash warriors was wildly unorthodox. The sources refer to their beliefs as gulat, meaning extremist or exaggerated. They synthesize elements of popular Islam with ancient pre-Islamic shamanistic traditions from the Central Asian steppes.
It was a very unique blend.
Most crucially, their devotion to the leader of the Safavi order was absolute. They did not view him merely as a political commander or a wise teacher. They believed he was a literal divine reincarnation, the promised messianic savior. He was the perfect guide, incapable of error. And due to a series of assassinations and wars that wiped out the older generation, that mantle of divine, absolute leadership falls directly onto the shoulders of a young teenager, Ismail.
And Ismail's genetic lineage is a perfect microcosm of the chaotic, deeply interconnected world of the 15th century. Through his father, he inherited the profound spiritual authority of the Safavi Sufi masters. But his maternal lineage was entirely different.
Oh, it's wild.
His mother, Martha, was the daughter of Uzun Hasan, a terrifyingly powerful Turkmen warlord who ruled a vast confederation. Even more remarkably, Martha's mother, Ismail's grandmother, was a Greek Byzantine princess from the royal Christian house of Trebizond, located on the Black Sea coast.
So coursing through the veins of this boy is the blood of Byzantine royalty, ruthless Turkmen warlords, and revered Sufi mystics. Because rival factions view his bloodline as an existential threat, Ismail spends his entire early childhood being hunted, hidden away in the dense forested regions near the Caspian Sea. He survives by the absolute loyalty of a small inner circle of Qizilbash guardians.
It's like something out of a novel.
It really is. Then in 1501, at the age of 15, he emerges from the forests. He rallies his fanatic Qizilbash warriors, marches on the major city of Tabriz, and declares himself the Shah.
And he does not stop at a mere declaration. Ismail immediately unleashes an explosive, hyper-aggressive military campaign. Driven by their belief in his divinity, his highly mobile, light cavalry tribal forces sweep across the plateau.
They just overwhelm everyone.
In a remarkably compressed time frame, this teenager conquers an immense territory, stretching from the borders of eastern Anatolia deep into the heart of central Iran, shattering the armies of older, established regional rulers.
Viewing this objectively, the audacity is breathtaking. But it raises a massive logistical and political question. Fanaticism, surprise, and mobile cavalry can certainly win battles. But how does a 15-year-old, backed primarily by a cult following of illiterate nomadic warriors, actually transition from conquering to building a functional, lasting state administration? Especially considering that his newly claimed territory is completely sandwiched between two established massive superpowers. The mighty Ottoman Empire expanding from the west, and the formidable Uzbek confederations threatening from the east.
It's the ultimate problem of statecraft. But Ismail's brilliance lay in his realization that raw, messianic fanaticism has a very short half-life.
Right.
It is highly volatile and ultimately unsustainable for governing a complex agrarian and urban society. He intuitively understood that to prevent his new empire from being absorbed by the Sunni Ottomans or the Sunni Uzbeks, he needed to erect an ideological fortress as impenetrable as the Zagros Mountains. He needed a unifying, distinct state ideology that would irrevocably separate his subjects from their powerful neighbors.
His solution to that geopolitical problem resulted in one of the most abrupt, dramatic, and brutal forced religious conversions in human history. Ismail issues a world-altering decree. He declares that Twelver Shi'ism is now the mandatory, exclusive state religion of his empire.
And what makes this decree so astonishing is the demographic reality of the time. In 1501, the vast majority of the population living on the Iranian plateau were Sunni Muslims.
Right, so he's forcing this on almost everyone.
Yes, it was an aggressive, top-down paradigm shift enforced through sheer terror. Ismail dispatched itinerant propagandists, backed by heavily armed contingents of Qizilbash cavalry, into the streets, bazaars, and mosques of every major city he conquered. The population was presented with a horrific ultimatum. Publicly curse the first three caliphs of Sunni Islam, a profoundly blasphemous act for a Sunni believer, or face immediate execution.
The historical accounts of this enforcement are chilling. When the population of Tabriz, his newly declared capital, showed initial resistance and reluctance to abandon their Sunni faith, Ismail ordered the massacre of thousands of citizens. As his armies pushed southward and eastward, the terror multiplied. He systematically executed prominent Sunni dignitaries, scholars, and judges in cultural capitals like Isfahan and Shiraz.
He was completely uncompromising.
When he captured Baghdad, he deliberately desecrated deeply venerated Sunni shrines. To demonstrate his absolute break from the past, he even ordered his followers to exhume the bones of rival dynasty leaders and publicly burn them. It was a calculated campaign of psychological and physical devastation designed to break the will of the majority and enforce total compliance.
However, beneath the sheer brutality of the conversion, there was a structural genius and an enduring tragedy to Ismail's method. Having mandated Shi'ism, Ismail faced a severe administrative crisis. There were practically no native Shi scholars or jurists within Iran capable of actually teaching the intricacies of Shi theology and law to the terrified, newly converted masses.
He had the decree, but not the personnel.
Exactly. Furthermore, he could not entrust the creation of a complex, sophisticated legal bureaucracy to his Qizilbash warriors. They were nomadic fighters, entirely unsuited for urban administration, and their radical Ghulah beliefs were incompatible with orthodox statecraft.
So recognizing he lacks the internal software to run his new empire, he outsources it.
Precisely. Ismail initiates a massive importation of highly educated Orthodox Arab Shia jurists. He brings them primarily from the region of Jabal Amil, located in modern-day Lebanon, as well as from southern Iraq and Bahrain.
Wow.
These scholars had long been marginalized and persecuted in their Sunni-dominated homelands. Ismail offers them a staggering proposition: sanctuary, immense wealth, vast land grants, and unparalleled political power if they migrate to Iran and build his new religious and legal infrastructure from the ground up.
It is a profoundly Machiavellian maneuver. By importing these foreign Arab clerics, Ismail solves multiple existential threats simultaneously. He acquires the elite intellectual capital needed to build a legitimate, functioning legal system. He effectively sidelines and replaces the native Persian Sunni elite, removing a massive potential source of rebellion.
Right.
And crucially, he manufactures a brand new clerical class that is entirely dependent on the throne for their wealth and survival. This new, loyal establishment acts as a vital counterweight, checking the dangerous, unpredictable influence of his own radical Qizilbash warlords. He brilliantly manipulates the pieces on the chessboard to stabilize the center.
And this maneuver successfully stabilized the internal regime, cementing the Safavid dynasty's grip on power. However, it permanently and aggressively alienated Iran from its neighbors. By carving out an aggressively Shiite state, Ismail transformed political borders into harsh, unyielding religious borders.
A huge shift.
Yeah, the Ottoman sultans and the Uzbek khans no longer viewed the Iranian monarch merely as a territorial rival. They viewed him as a dangerous, heretical threat to the very fabric of Islam. This ideological schism locked the Iranian plateau into centuries of devastating geostrategic warfare.
The intensity of that geopolitics is staggering, perfectly encapsulated by the brutal showdown in 1510 in the northeastern city of Marv. The adversary was the formidable Sunni Uzbek Confederation, led by Shaban Khan. Shaban Khan had been aggressively raiding into Iran's eastern provinces, deliberately looting Shii shrines, massacring populations, and sending deeply insulting, mocking letters to Ismail, challenging his legitimacy.
Ismail responds by marching his Qizilbash armies eastward across the harsh terrain to confront the Uzbeks directly. In a massive, decisive battle, Ismail employs superior tactical maneuvering, drawing the Uzbek forces into an ambush. The Uzbek army breaks and attempts to flee. In the ensuing chaotic slaughter, Shaiban Khan is trapped and trampled to death by his own retreating cavalry.
A decisive victory.
Yes. The aftermath of this victory, however, transitions from brilliant military strategy into something deeply macabre.
The sources recount the celebration in explicit, horrifying detail. Ismail locates the crushed body of Shaiban Khan on the battlefield. He orders the Uzbek leader's head to be severed. He has the skull meticulously cleaned, heavily coated in gold, encrusted with precious jewels, and fashioned into a royal wine goblet, from which Ismail subsequently drinks during his victory feasts.
Unbelievable.
He has Shaiban Khan's right arm severed and sends it via courier to a rival ruler in Kabul, dropping it in his court as a horrifying mafia-style warning. Most disturbingly, to demonstrate their absolute fanatical devotion to their messianic Shah, a faction of the Qizilbash warriors actually cannibalized the remains of Shaiban Khan's body on the battlefield.
While it appears to modern sensibilities as pure, unhinged barbarism within the context of 16th century warfare, it served a highly calculated, terrifying diplomatic function. Ismail actually had the skin of Shaiban Khan's severed head stuffed with straw and dispatched it across the continent to the court of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul.
It's all psychological warfare.
It was an instrument of profound psychological warfare. The message was unmistakable. The Safavid Shi'i state has arrived. We are utterly ruthless, our people are fanatically devoted, and we will not be eradicated.
And readers of Amanat's book frequently draw a direct, compelling line between the actions of Ismail in the 16th century and the political realities of the late 20th century. Reviewers consistently note that Ismail's violent forging of the state laid the absolute structural blueprint for modern Iran.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the parallel drawn by historians and readers centers on the fusion of state power with a specifically imported, highly organized Shi'i clerical establishment. We see a mirror image centuries later during the 1979 Islamic Revolution. In both historical moments, a revolutionary movement successfully establishes a uniquely Shi'i political entity, deliberately isolating itself as an ideological island within a much broader, predominantly Sunni Middle East.
Reviewers highlight a fascinating long-term consequence of Ismail's chess move. The institutional power of the clerics, the ulama, which Ismail built from scratch and endowed with vast land and wealth to solidify his own rule, slowly accumulated independent momentum. Over the course of 500 years, that clerical class grew so deeply entrenched and powerful that eventually, under Ayatollah Khomeini, they no longer needed the Shah.
Exactly.
They were able to sweep the monarch off the board entirely and claim ultimate, absolute political authority for themselves. The pieces were placed on the board in 1501, but the endgame is still actively unfolding today.
It is a testament to profound historical continuity. The Safavids, driven by a teenage mystic and armed nomads, violently grew the geographic, ideological, and psychological borders that continue to define the Iranian nation. They locked the country into a permanent state of ideological tension with its neighbors, and they forged a complex, deeply fraught internal alliance between the throne, the bazaar, and the mosque that would dictate Iranian politics for half a millennium.
So what does this all mean? Let's take a step back and survey the entire tapestry we have unrolled today. We began by examining the sheer brutality of the geography, the towering mountains, the arid deserts, and the incredibly fragile Quanit water systems that kept society alive. We saw how the constant threat of ecological collapse and nomadic raids necessitated the creation of a massive, heavily centralized authority.
We explored the ancient game of kings, the conditional divine far of the Shah, and the lethal, perpetual chess match played out between the paranoid monarchs, their ambitious, doomed viziers, and the warlords on the periphery. We walked through the physical layout of the cities, witnessing the immense economic leverage of the bazaar, striking against the military power of the citadel.
We also illuminated the populations operating in the shadows of those structures, the hidden matriarchies within the inner quarters, the complex realities of temporary marriage, the cultural impacts of assimilated enslaved populations, and the vital economic networks managed by marginalized religious minorities.
And critically, we mapped the Persian paradox. How a society living under the crushing weight of strict legalism and autocracy managed to preserve a vibrant, subversive inner life through the resilient beauty of poetry and language.
Finally, we witnessed the explosion of the Safavid shockwave. We saw how a 15-year-old boy harnessed the apocalyptic fervor of nomadic warriors to conquer a plateau, and how he subsequently utilized mass terror and the importation of foreign clerics to forcefully weld a Shia identity onto a Sunni population, permanently altering the geopolitical balance of the Middle East.
The ultimate takeaway is that attempting to comprehend the Iran of today through the narrow lens of the daily news cycle is an exercise in futility. You have to recognize the centuries-old chessboard. You have to understand that the state, the clerical establishment, the merchant class, and the incredibly diverse populace are locked in a historical dynamic of survival, cultural preservation, and power negotiation that was set in motion over 500 years ago.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We explored the deeply ingrained psychological concept of Zahir and Batin, the stark division between the heavily curated, strictly conforming public face and the rich, hidden, subversive, and authentic private inner world. For centuries, through devastating invasions, autocratic reigns, and strict religious policing, the Iranian people have utilized this concept of batin as an ultimate cultural survival mechanism. It is how they preserve their joy, their ancient music, their poetry, and their true identities under the constant gaze of dogmatic authorities.
It's an incredibly powerful tool.
It really is. Given the undeniable, historically proven resilience of this secret internal world, how might this ancient, perfected habit of secret subversion ultimately dictate the outcome of Iran's current and future struggles? If a population has spent over 1,000 years mastering the art of keeping their souls hidden and vibrant behind closed doors, can any rigid, modern state structure ever truly hope to conquer them? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.